And you're an expert on Russia. You've spoken about, I suppose, the fall of the US, the rise of China. What do you think we should be looking for, sort of, I guess, across the global stage in the next year or 2 years?
I think it depends whether you're talking about Europe or the wider world. I think in Europe, Russia is the key factor, the key unpredictable, the key destabilizer. I think in the wider world, China, and in the longer term, will become more of a challenge to us because of its economic power and its size. So in a sense, you're almost looking at, I think the phrase is, Russia makes the weather, but China makes the climate, which is probably true in a literal sense as well, given its level of emissions and so on, and the climate crisis, which, of course, has now been put on the back burner because of all this, as has the humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan that is developing and no one is now talking about anymore. So we have to get serious. I mean, I think a lot of the political discourse in this country, is not really serious or real world enough to understand and appreciate just what a challenge we've got coming, because I think it's a big challenge.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. I'm keen to move to audience questions.
Yeah.
If you have one, do raise your hand or your membership card. And take a question from the member on the bench just there. Thanks, Spencer.
Thanks. You spoke before about Russian meddling in British elections, in the US as well, and your disappointment at the lack of Russian resistance to Putin, effectively. Does the UK, does the US have their own initiatives to build fifth column, to build resistance within places like Russia and China, or is that something that they abstain from?
Ultimately, I don't entirely know the answer to that question, not definitively. In general, the experience of trying to do that kind of operation has not been a good one. And it's much better in so many ways if the people of those countries topple their own governments, have their own sort of leverage over their own governments. I think it's very important that our values and our education and everything else is made, and travel is made available to people from those places, particularly young people, particularly the elite, dare I say, that they are exposed effectively to our values and our culture, because by and large, when you talk to young Russians, certainly in private, there's no doubt that they vote for that in our direction. The problem is that they've got a very entrenched security and militaristic apparatus, which is suppressing them on a daily basis and lying to them on a daily basis. And so information is very important, communications are very important, and things like culture are very important. They're slow working. But they are effective, and that's where we need to be looking, I think.
And we'll take a question from the elected member of Access Committee.
How do you think Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, what impact do you think it will have on the Chinese position towards Taiwan? Do you think it will cause an acceleration in their aim of forced reunification, or do you think it's too soon to tell?
Going to absolute basics here, I think that the difficulty of the Russian operation in Ukraine it is going through some difficulties now, but fundamentally the difficulty is the longer term. So in other words, rolling your tanks across the border is the easy bit, and actually coming to some kind of settlement. There's this old phrase, if you break it, you own it, as the Americans found out in Iraq. And I think that is what Russia will face. Whereas I think for China and Taiwan, the difficult bit's the first bit, is getting the Navy and the troops across the straits. That isn't at all straightforward. And I suspect that there's quite a high chance that actually a Chinese invading navy would be sunk on the way across. So I think that's their calculation. They're also much more gradualist, much slower in trying to achieve their objectives, the Chinese. They're not. They have a different mentality to the Russians. The Russians are like, have a sense of entitlement as a world power that is probably no longer justified by their population and their wealth. The Chinese are much more reticent. They're much more careful, slower to do what they're doing. I think they realise that economic power actually is paramount in the rise of their country, and not military power. And therefore, if they're going to be able to reincorporate somewhere like Taiwan, it's probably going to be done economically rather than necessarily militarily, I think.
We'll take a question from the member on the front bench just over here.
You mentioned Russia's use of misinformation in the campaign. Do you think there's scope for, and is it the time for democracies to use misinformation towards strategic and tactical aims?
Not in a sort of policy sense, no. It may be on a battlefield in Ukraine. There may be some space for using disinformation to confuse an enemy. But I think fundamentally what democracies should be doing is, I do believe that, our communications and everything else, as I've said, is very important. But fundamentally we should have the confidence to rely on truth. And it should be the truth that we are, broadcasting into Russia and other places where the truth is a very low priority, if at all, in the governance of the country. And I do believe that the budgets for the BBC and Radio Free Europe and all the others should be increased, and we should be trying to communicate more systematically with the populations of these countries than we are at the moment. In their languages, obviously, as well.
We'll take a question from the member just over here.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. So I'm from Sweden, and in Sweden there's a lot of talk now about joining NATO as well, and that is also going on in Finland. As you know, Putin's narrative is that the existence of NATO wasn't or isn't justified after the fall of Soviet, and he has been complaining about how NATO has been expanding, and as far as I understand it, that is the main concern, so to speak. So I'm just wondering, first of all, if you think it was a mistake to expand NATO to the Baltic countries or Poland, and secondly, what you think would be a wise strategy for Finland and Sweden in regards to NATO membership at this point?
Very good question. I don't think it was a mistake to expand NATO. I think ultimately, if a country is sovereign, and if a country's system of governance and its system of law and its system of military and defence policy is compatible with NATO's requirements, then it should be free to apply to join NATO. I think there were some mistakes made going back a way, particularly by the former Vice President Cheney in the day, talking about Georgia joining and Ukraine joining, massively prematurely. I think that joining NATO is a big step, clearly, for any country to accept that it is responsible for the collective defence of many other countries is a huge change, actually. And if I was running Sweden and Finland now, I would be thinking very carefully about joining. I'd be looking at the compatibility of that with, other commitments and other responsibilities and so on. But I think ultimately both Finland and Sweden should be free to join NATO if that's what their people want, and we should welcome them in. NATO, after all, is a defensive alliance. It is not conceivable in any real-world situation that NATO would attack Russia. It's ridiculous.
And a question from the member in the blue jumper.
Hi, thank you for coming. I wanted your comment on two things. First, Putin pretty much threatened the West with nuclear war a couple of days ago. I'm wondering if that's what make you make the comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even if before that threat, that was something that was on your mind. And secondly, there have been stories, I think mostly unproven, about Putin's mental health. And I wanted to know whether in a system like Russia's that doesn't seem to have many checks and balances, whether that sort of thing is relevant and something we should be thinking about.
I've certainly thought up until now that Russia was not a monolithic country. And I've seen a lot of intelligence over the years, both government and our own private, which suggests that actually it's quite a complex government and leadership, far more so than you might think. What they do, of course, is that they don't show that to us in the open. We don't have debates in the Duma where people are ripping shreds off each other, and that makes it more difficult to read. I am concerned, however, that certainly over the last couple of years, that kind of collective pluralism in the leadership that Russia seems to have had in the recent past, seems to be weaker. So I am concerned that it's become more autocratic, more dictatorial under Putin, and that's a big cause of concern. And I think the difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the situation we're in now is that the Soviet Union had structures. The Soviet Union had, however perverse they might have seemed collective ways of doing things. The architecture of the state was the real architecture of the state, and so on. The situation we've got at the moment is that it's very difficult to discern who has influence over Putin and how it's exercised. And a lot of it's very capricious, a lot of it's very personal. It's far more like an Ottoman court, Russia now, than the Soviet Union was like a sort of structured communist state. And the amount of power I think that Putin has accumulated in his own hands now is a really big problem.
We'll take a question from the member in the scarf. Just behind you, Spencer.
Sorry, one other thing on that. I don't think he's about to go to nuclear war with us or a nuclear strike. I don't think it's got to that point. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that even the lunatics running North Korea have never got to that stage. So I think it's pretty unlikely. But there is a small threat of it, and the threat will come if things spiral out of control in the way that we were talking about just now.
What do you think of Zelensky's decision-making so far during the conflict? And do you think Ukraine has a chance of achieving their goals of joining NATO and the EU and repelling the current Russian force?
I think Zelensky has been exemplary in the way he has run his country over this last period. Vastly exceeded expectations, given that his background wasn't one in politics or the military, and he will emerge from history as a hero in some ways, like Dubček and others in the past. However, I do think that the government in Ukraine will probably fall. And that in the short term, Ukraine will not be a free and democratic country. Medium to longer term, I would be quite optimistic that we can get to a situation where we have a more reasonable government running Russia, even if it's autocratic, and that Ukraine can get some breathing space. My real fear is that in 6 months' time, Kiev and Kharkiv will look like Aleppo did in Syria. And that's what we've got to try and avoid at all costs.
We probably have time for one final question. The member in the black coat just there.
Hi. I was just wondering about your comment earlier that Russia makes the weather, yet China makes the climate. What do you think in this situation China's role will be, if indeed any role?
I think China's caught on a dilemma, really, because China's rhetoric as a state is that the sovereignty of countries is inviolable, and that it's actually China is actually quite a conservative country in some ways, geopolitically, in a way that Russia isn't. On the other hand, obviously, China does have this rivalry with the US. It is in China's interest that the US be discredited around the world in whatever situation you're talking, whether it's Kabul airport or whatever. And so I think China's views of this will be very mixed. China will never be Russia's ally.
Apologies for the delay. I believe all systems are bottlenecked right now, so it's basically YouTube not coming through. So please bear with me. Thank you all very much.
And in fact, I would argue that if there ever will be a land invasion of Russia, it will come from China, not from the West. But China will like the fact that America and the West have been distracted by this, are going to have to spend vast resources on this, whilst they will quietly go about their business in other parts of the world, importing oil from Iran or whatever they do, and buying up large parts of Africa and Sri Lanka and other places. But fundamentally, I don't think the Chinese leadership is supportive of the sort of instability and unpredictability of where we are at the moment. And obviously, it's not in China's interest that a full-scale war would break out in this part of the world, or that there would be a nuclear exchange. So I think that in public, they will be neutral, if not slightly sneering towards the West. In private, they're probably telling Putin where his red lines are, I suspect. It's interesting, isn't it, that this invasion took place the day after or virtually the day after the Olympics had ended in Beijing, and I think that tells you something of the relative power relationship between China and Russia in reality.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us. We'll finish with a question we've asked all of our speakers this term, which is if you could leave our audience this evening with one thing to think about for the rest of the week, what would that be?
I think it's that life is about, and careers particularly, about taking calculated risks. And if you don't risk anything, you don't achieve anything. And when I look back on my career, a lot of it happened not by chance, but not predictably. But I would say that the big things that I've done in my life that have been positive, whether it was going to Russia on a posting at 25 or leaving a civil service job at 45 and starting up a small business, all the things I've done in life that I look back on with great pride have involved risk, albeit a calculated risk.
Thank you so much. Do join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. in the chamber for our emergency event on Ukraine. We'll have a panel of specialists to talk about the changing situation. Thank you so much for joining us, Christopher. Please join me in welcoming or thanking Christopher Steele.
Finally I got it to stop. So, what are the chances of a negotiated solution here? Could the Second World War have come to an end with a negotiated solution? Could the Cold War have come to an end with a negotiated solution? I'm starting to think that history says there is no negotiated solution until somebody's down on their knees. And the needs that are potentially at risk are the needs of Ukraine, the needs of Russia. We've also got the needs of Moldova, and there was one other, the needs of Belarus. So something that I thought was going to unfold really quick, bang, 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 Russia, big bear Russia, come in and kill everybody they want to and take over everything, didn't happen, because Russia are obviously all bravado and corruption. So, yeah, and the Russian people suffer. So let me see if I can get this audio problem fixed up. I guess the first thing I need to do is to disappear myself, which I'll do like that. And then let's just see if the audio system kicks in or how long it takes.
Communications.
Boy, this is kind of one of the longer freezes, I guess you call it. Hello. Yeah, well, here's the new setup while we wait for this an apple bomb from the Atlantic to catch up. Here is the new presentation. I am now on Discord, so if you do want to join.
Hello and welcome to Unheard. I'm Freddie Sayers. So we've got a bit of a different episode for you today. The news coming out of Ukraine has shocked and surprised us all. And I've been really thinking about who we can trust with these kind of questions. Which sources can we put faith in? Has it changed our view of how credible the establishment is? And someone who's been having thoughts about that is a friend and a host of a different channel, Trigonometry, and his name is Konstantin Kisin, and he joins us. Hi, Konstantin.
Hey, Freddie, thanks for having me.
So I saw a Twitter thread that you had posted where you were sort of explaining how you felt the anti-establishment or alternative voices and media have basically got this Russia question wrong. Tell us about that.
Well, the thread did concentrate somewhat on that, but the thread also concentrated on how the mainstream media have got this wrong as well. My central argument is I think there are different reasons for the mainstream getting it wrong versus the alt media. I think the alt media got it wrong because we're all stuck in this culture war bubble where we interpret everything through the prism of the other things we already believe. And so it's been kind of strange and also humbling in a way for me to watch, because a lot of people that I'd normally agree with are really not very clued up on this particular issue and are just frankly embarrassing themselves over the last couple of weeks. And the reason they're doing that is not because they're bad people or because they're stupid or because of anything like that. The reason they're doing this is it fits what they already believe. And what they already believe mainly is the mainstream media is constantly lying to them, which it is. The mainstream media is not trustworthy, which it's not. The politicians that talk to us are not telling us the truth, which they're not. And therefore, anything the media say, anything the politicians say is automatically untrue. Now, as a heuristic, this doesn't work very well because it prevents you from seeing the truth from the lies. So that's the alt media. The mainstream media have got this wrong because, I think they're probably just lazy. Vladimir Putin, you talk about who should we listen and trust on this. Vladimir Putin did an hour speech on Russian television, which was translated into every major language in the world a few days ago, in which he told you exactly what was going to happen. Exactly. And when you say people are shocked and surprised, I don't understand why, because all you need to do is spend an hour listening to what he said, and you would know that what I predicted would happen, which is there would be an invasion, that it wouldn't stop in the east of Ukraine. And we can talk more about what he said in that speech. But basically, it's just laziness. I think no one in Western media has an hour to sit down and listen to a politician talking.
I mean, I'll confess that I have also been unsure in the last few weeks because, you know, part of our job, I feel, is to probe the kind of establishment narrative and make sure to question it. And you're right that there were voices both on the left and the right, definitely the kind of anti-war left, but also the what you'd call the populist right, the kind of Tucker Carlson end, were very much of the line that this is all a kind of American fantasy, or it's all in some way propaganda, they're going to benefit from it somehow, the invasion's never going to happen. We had Nigel Farage, who's recently been on your show today, kind of eating humble pie because he was saying, I didn't think this would happen, and it has. What should we conclude from that? Is it that on questions of kind of intelligence, military intelligence, people like the United States government still hold all the cards and the rest of us are kind of scrabbling around, and they knew quite clearly and said this would happen, and a lot of people who are sort of more in the pundit end just didn't know anything better?
Well, as I say, I think the one thing I've taken away from it for myself is that I think I ought to refrain from commenting on things I don't understand. I think a standard that we ought to all try and abide by, and we haven't been. There's a lot of us now who sort of feel like I think every issue we are supposed to have an opinion about, and I get invited on TV and podcasts and radio that I've been turning down in the last few months, because I've already been aware of this trend that we're all increasingly asked to comment on things that we don't really understand. But how do we pass an event like this? And by the way, I'm glad Nigel is come out and said that, because him and I had a big argument about this on our show, and this was the one major area of where we had a big bust up about it. I think actually the information is there, but you have to try and look for sources of information that, you know, people who have an understanding of the history of the region, who maybe speak the language, who maybe have been there at least. If you think about journalism 20 or 30 years ago, the people who'd be talking to you are people who'd been embedded in that country for 20 years. They understood the local language, the customs, the politics, the history. And right now, as you well know, you know, television is made mainly by 20-year-olds. You see the older faces in front of the screen, but behind the scenes, it's very young people. We've been living in a dream world, Freddie. We've been living in a world in which we imagine that, you know, things like, can you transition from one sex to another, and all of that is much more important than real world stuff like land, money, espionage, power, oil, etc. And I think and hope that this is an opportunity for that veil to be lifted from our eyes.
Yeah, so I want to come on to the kind of actual situation in a second, but since we're both in the business of kind of looking for voices and trying to find who we should be bringing in front of the audience, are you worried that this conversation will not be popular with either of our audiences? I mean, do you think, you know, I tuned into the live stream you did earlier, and some of the comments as you were talking were kind of saying the opposite. You know, that it was sort of Russia has the land, deflection and diversion tactics, Uncle Vlad rules, the Chinese will bail Russia out, Western propaganda, etc., etc. Are you now going to have a kind of battle with your audience on this Russia question, do you think?
I never care about what people think about what I say. I try to say the truth as I see it. Now, often I fail to live up to that because I don't know all of the things that are true.
Let's lay it down then. What is the raw situation as you understand it? What is your attitude to what's happened in the past 24 hours?
Well, rather than my own attitude, and I think it's important for me to explain that, you know, I have family in both Russia and Ukraine, but I'm not talking about it from the perspective of what's best for Konstantin Kissin's family or anything like that. I'm interested as someone who lives in the West, who's a citizen of this country, who wants the UK and America to be strong and powerful and capable, and the values that we uphold here to be defended and protected. I want us to be in as good position as we can be. So everything I'm saying is from that position. Now, Vladimir Putin's speech, which he gave two days ago, in which he explained his rationale, was extraordinary. We've never heard anything like this in this country, certainly in my lifetime, where a politician spends an hour laying out the history of the region and why this happened and why that happened. But the basic points that he makes in the speech are this. Number one, the existence of Ukraine is a historical mistake. It's a mistake that results from weak decisions made by weak Soviet leaders, starting with Vladimir Lenin. And these are decisions that he has no reason to respect because they were mistakes and they were made for bad reasons and they were ahistorical. And the reason he says that is, in his conception, the Russian people, the Russian nation, was split up artificially, and a piece of the Russian nation was portioned off and put together with a bunch of territories that used to belong to Hungary and Poland. And merged into what we now call Ukraine. So Ukraine shouldn't exist, is what he's essentially saying. And when he says it was put together with Polish and Hungarian land, what that tells you is at least half of Ukraine, and probably more, certainly up to and including Kiev and maybe beyond, is in his sights. So this isn't going to end in those two eastern regions in Donetsk and Lugansk. It's going to carry on if he is able to carry it on.
And we should probably say that claim of his is highly dubious, in fact, just wrong, is it not? That, you know, I mean, Ukraine, as far as I understand, was there, you could say, before Russia, and is has been a complex, evolving historical entity like a lot of places in Eastern Europe. But the idea that it was like created by Russia is hard to defend.
Look, the history of this region is very, very difficult. We don't have the time to get into the nuances of that. I think the important thing to consider here is not who is historically entirely accurate or not, but rather, should a neighbor invade a neighbor because it has some historical claim against its territory? That's really the question.
So you don't reject the Putin narrative?
I think that there are elements of which are true. I think there are elements of it which are untrue. But he makes the claim, and this is the second part where I think we start to get into things that are less true, is he talks about the Russian ethnic people and Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine being genocided. That's what he's saying. And he goes on then to claim that Ukraine is about to launch an attack. He also talks about, he mentions the CIA more than David Icke in that speech. And he talks essentially about how Russia is being enclosed by the West, which is expanding NATO, and NATO is not a defensive alliance in his view. NATO is an aggressive force that wants to put as many missile bases as close to Russia as possible. And these missile bases are not defensive in nature. They are in order that the Americans can strike in the heart of Russia with nuclear weapons at any point in time. And he literally says this in terms. So what he's essentially saying is he has launched us into a second Cold War. We are, best case scenario, now in Cold War II, and we should act accordingly.
Let's just respond to those claims again, though. I mean, what's your reaction to that? I mean, there's a lot in there, but I think the claims of genocide and imminent attacks from Ukraine, I think we can safely say do not appear to be true.
Well, as a friend of mine in Ukraine put it to me, we waited until Putin had 200,000 troops on the border before attacking.
Right.
I mean, that seems unlikely, doesn't it?
And this NATO thing is one of the big talking points, isn't it? Those people, and they range from kind of, well, Nigel Farage we've mentioned, but Peter Hitchens, Glenn Greenwald, those kind of people will say that it was hubristic expansion of NATO by the West in the 90s and beyond that have kind of provoked the Russian bear, and that in some way this is the fault of the powers that controlled NATO. Do you think that's true?
I think there's an element of truth to that, but I think it's entirely the wrong frame for looking at the situation. I'm not interested in Russia, and I'm not interested in what Russia wants, and I'm not interested in what provoked Russia. I'm interested in what the West is doing. And I want the West to be the dominant power in the world. I want Western values to be the dominant values in the world, because having come from another part of the world, I can tell you they're much better. They're better than the values of Russia. They're better than the values of China. And I'm not interested in how provoked Russia or China are by the West asserting its dominance around the world. I want Western dominance around the world. Now, as for whether Russia is a bear that's been provoked, I don't think that's the right frame to look at it at all. Russia's not a bear, Russia's a wolf, and it's hungry. And the reason NATO is expanding eastwards is that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all have Russian-speaking minorities that can be weaponized in exactly the same way that the Russian minority in Ukraine has been weaponized. They all used to be part of the Soviet Union, having been annexed by Stalin while Europe was busy dealing with Hitler. And so they see this coming, and Ukraine saw this coming, which is why they were so desperate to join NATO in the first place. And
it's worth saying, just to quickly interrupt there, that there were examples of Russian kind of territorial expansion before the NATO expansion. Like there were regions of Georgia and elsewhere that became controversial, and there were wars.
Yes, and by the way, if you want to talk about promises the West made and then broke, yes, the West promised Russia not to expand NATO eastwards, but it also promised Ukraine that in exchange for Ukraine giving up the one thing that would have protected Ukraine, its nuclear weapons, they made Ukraine give those weapons away and said, we will protect you, right? So those promises have been broken as well, right? This is what you've got to understand. But in terms of the expansion of NATO, I don't understand how Russia is safer from NATO by moving its border further west so that it's closer to NATO. That doesn't make any sense to me. If you're concerned about NATO missile silos in Eastern Europe, well, you've just moved your border closer to them. How does that make Russia safer?
I suppose their rationale will be they're sort of demilitarizing and de-weaponizing that zone so they can have they can police their own neutral zone or something like that. That would be the internal rationale.
Yeah.
The big question has to be, if you want Western values to succeed, if you want the West to assert itself, how is it going to do that? That's where it's hard to find much by way of practical advice, because no one seems to be saying, let's put boots on the ground. I mean, I literally haven't even heard the kind of neocons saying that, and they would traditionally be the people to do that. Very few people are saying maybe we should have a no-fly zone or something, but they're a small minority. Pretty much everyone seems to agree that the only response at this point is some form of sanctions. No one is saying we go to war over this. Do you agree with that? Are you part of that consensus?
Yeah, I don't think we want Western troops on the ground fighting against Russia. There are maybe other ways of dealing with the situation once we know how this particular situation works out, right? This is going to end at some point. Where that border ends up being, do we have UN peacekeepers making sure that Russia doesn't carry on? That may be a conversation for another time. But in terms of what we should do, Freddie, the question that everyone asks me this question, and I always ask him a question in return, which is, what do you want, right? Because it's like that scene from Alice in Wonderland where Alice meets the Cheshire Cat. And she says to the cat, where should I go from here? And the cat says, well, that depends on where you want to get to. And Alice says, well, I don't mind where I get to. And the cat says, well, it doesn't matter then where you go, right? What do you want?
If we agree, which I think you and I do, and I suspect a lot of other people do, that a kind of more confident assertion of the good values that the West has developed would be a good thing. And with that comes some kind of geopolitical assertion, I suppose, to defend and protect them. What does that look like? No one seems to have that answer.
Well, the answer is very simple. Then you have to accept the gauntlet that Vladimir Putin has thrown down. He has essentially said we are in Cold War II, and we have to act accordingly.
Which means what?
You have to. Well, that depends on whether the West is willing to assert itself. That may mean, as I say, economic sanctions. It may mean putting peacekeepers in once we know where the border is going to be. It may mean also that these discussions are way above your pay grade. No offense to either of us. My point is broadly this: you have to accept reality before you know what you want to do about it, right? So the first thing we've got to do in the West is wake up from the slumber that we've been in for the last 20 years, where we've imagined and deluded ourselves into thinking that everyone everywhere thinks like us, that everyone everywhere wants liberal democracy, that everyone everywhere just wants peace and trade and all of these wonderful things. And the most important thing is we find some unicorns and rainbows and sing Kumbaya together. That is not how the real world works. There are people coming and they want to take what we have. They want to take our top dog status in the world, whether that's Russia or China. And I don't blame them, because all they're trying to do is what they see as being best for their people. They want to be rich. They want to be powerful. They want to be prosperous. And we are in that position, and they want to replace us. That's as simple as that.
It's a Game of Thrones world. It's a multipolar world where everybody is trying to win. And it looks like that has now become a reality. I mean, Russia is doing this. We don't know when China may or may not go for Taiwan and test.
Is there better than a day than today to do that?
I hope you're wrong, but I understand what you mean.
I hope I'm wrong too, but I don't think I am. Like, I've been hoping I'm wrong about Ukraine for the last 8 years, since 2014, because I said at the time, this isn't the end. If you let people do this, they are going to become emboldened.
The result of what you're saying, and I know you're saying this above your pay grade, I'm not asking you to design a new military strategy, but the thrust of it, as someone who cares about the kind of direction of our society, is that there are hostile, powerful actors out there, and that we need to become more powerful, fundamentally. And
no, I don't think we need to become more powerful.
Well, we need to have hard power to repel them, and we need to be willing to use it.
That's different. See, the American military is by far and away the biggest and most powerful military in the world. The Western world is by far and away the most powerful alliance in the world. The question is, are we willing to use that power in any way? Are we willing to risk anything? Are we willing to risk gas supplies to Germany? Are we willing to risk all sorts of other things that we no longer get to have if we take a strong stance on this issue? Is the City of London willing to give up the billions of Russian criminal proceeds that get sifted through every year through the legal firms and the banks and the real estate market here in London? Are we willing to give all of that up initially? Are we willing to risk anything to defend ourselves and our values?
My feeling, as an answer to that, is that you get pretty much a majority. If you did an opinion poll or talk to anyone, you would get a majority of people who would be willing to go tough on Russians in London and give up millions, because there's no public support for that. The gas pipeline to Germany looks like it's already potentially in jeopardy. We'll see if that happens, but that, you know, they're going in that direction. Where it gets difficult is about human beings. So you say, okay, that we might get a situation where we need UN peacekeepers on the ground. They're going to come from some country, and that country will include ours. And at that point, you've got to have enough popular support to say, I'm going to send my son or my neighbor out to the Ukrainian border with a UN, you know, jacket on. And I'm not confident that there would be that public support at this point.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And I agree. I'm not calling for UN peacekeepers. I was just talking about the different options that might happen. What I'm saying to you is exactly what you've just said, which is NATO is dead, right? Because if you, and look, my wife is Ukrainian, right? And she called me up this morning and she was saying, well, you know, I hope the West takes strong sanctions on this. And, you know, they really need to stand up and defend. And I was like, yeah, I agree with you. But you're 7 months pregnant. Would you like me to go and fight in Ukraine? And she was like, no. I was like, okay, well, whose husband should go and fight in Ukraine? Whose son, whose father should go and fight in Ukraine? No one wants that. But the question is, what's the difference between Ukraine, which is outside of NATO, and Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia, which are inside of NATO? Do you want to go and fight to defend the sovereignty of Lithuania? How many people in the West do?
This is going to be the big question, because ultimately, if sanctions, everyone agrees about sanctions. There's an argument, are they tough enough? Will they work? You know, is the Russia economy now sufficiently independent with gas and with China helping it that the sanctions don't bite, blah, blah, blah. We'll try. I don't think anyone thinks Putin is suddenly going to turn around, do a 180 and say, oh, you've closed 3 Russian banks, therefore I'm going to retreat from Ukraine. Things like gas pipelines, I think he must have factored that in because it was pretty obvious that would happen. So ultimately, I think the key question is when? What would the line be for Western countries like ours to be willing to send soldiers, real human beings there? There are Russian men in uniform within Ukraine right now today. You know, Putin's done it. So you talk about, are we willing to assert our hard power? America has the biggest army in the world. What we're talking about is at some point down the line, would you be supportive of troops? What's your answer to that?
I don't have an answer to that, Freddie, because we don't know what's going to happen. I don't want World War III to start. I care very passionately about Ukraine and my friends there, and Russia and my friends there. I don't want these two countries to be at war. It ain't pretty. It ain't pretty. But the problem with all of this is, Freddie, is you don't get to choose when to send soldiers into war necessarily. Sometimes it is thrust upon you and you don't have a choice, which is why I can't commit and go, well, you know, if they invade France, then we definitely got to go and defend the French. I don't think that would be a popular position in Britain either, frankly, historically speaking.
Let me ask a slightly different question, which is, I've noticed in the last 24 hours already, the political battle in the UK has already moved to refugees. The social media streams are full of, now Britain must show its resolve by committing to take X number of refugees. There must be a high number. There will be millions of Ukrainians who are dispossessed and displaced. We must show our solidarity with the Ukrainian people by welcoming as many of them as possible into the UK. What's your response to that?
I don't think that's the right approach at all. I don't think that's necessary. I think there may be individual people who flee this eastern part of Ukraine or other parts of Ukraine that are invaded, who would be a genuine risk of murder or persecution by the people who take over. But I don't understand why the West's reaction to every crisis is to sort of decide that we must punish ourselves with further uncontrolled mass migration that is going to disrupt our countries even more than they already are. Part of the problem we have is we're disunited because of the constant churn in our societies, where we don't really have an identity that we can all say we're all British, because there's been a lot of disruption to our society because we've not encouraged people to integrate. So yet another wave of people who are going to come is unnecessary. People in Ukraine can flee to Western Ukraine. There are countries in the region which will be able to absorb that. I don't think that's the right approach at all, beyond individual cases.
But you're of Russian heritage. Your wife is Ukrainian. Do you not feel like, I mean, you're a highly successful immigrant. Why would the same opportunity not be offered to others?
Well, it's not the same opportunity. I didn't come here as a refugee. And I didn't come here as after a gigantic, rapid shift in the immigration patterns into this country. I came here in 1995 at a time when 3% of the British public thought that immigration was a major issue. During the Blair government, more people came into Britain that had come into this country since 1066, Freddie. We've seen a gigantic wave of immigration, which has raised that issue in the public consciousness. And look, the economic migrants, I've got no problem with them. I'm an economic migrant, but you've got to follow the rules. And I don't think that we should carry on with that. And every time there's a problem somewhere in the world, we suddenly decide that we must take a huge number of refugees. I think that if there are people who are genuinely at risk of persecution, we should offer the help. And it could be a few
Oh, sorry about that. I think that was my fault. I did something to bottleneck the YouTube. Sorry, YouTube. Please send sound.
thousand people who can come here and integrate. I've got absolutely no problem with that. But to say that we should take millions of Ukrainians is absurd.
I mean, it's something that we can control. I think that's part of the incentive, isn't it? It's also something we can argue about, which is where we feel comfortable. It can be a nice left-right battle. Everyone can shout on Twitter about it. Oh, we should have 5,000 or 15,000 or 100,000. Meanwhile, the war is happening the other side of Europe, and we're kind of aware that we have very little power to affect it in any way.
Well, this is my point, is rather than creating another refugee crisis for ourselves, why don't we actually think about how do we stop there being refugee crises like this, right? That's the question for our politicians to deal with. It's, as I say, it's not for you and I necessarily. The problem is, and we've been talking about it on Trigonometry for many years, the caliber of our leaders has declined just in the most astonishing way. These are not Churchills. These are not Reagans. These are not Thatchers. These are not even Blairs at this point. These are very small feral creatures engaged in some sort of reverse Darwinistic competition to lead these two husks of political parties that represent no one.
I don't disagree with you there at all. But I just wonder whether that's also maybe one of those kind of easy reflexes at this point, which is to say, oh, it must be to do with our weak leadership. The West has got such shit politicians and everything. But the reality, as you've just laid out, is that Russia is being aggressive, or the Russian government is expansionist in its mindset. And it's going to be trying to take advantage and expand its territory in some way. And that would be true whether we had good leaders or not.
Really? Interesting. So this is the uncomfortable question for sort of metropolitan liberals like you and I, Freddie, which is, would this have happened if the evil mean tweeting Donald Trump was still in power?
It's a very interesting counterfactual.
The answer to that, I'm afraid, is very clear and very obvious. It is an issue of weak leadership in the West, because this never would have happened under Donald Trump, who we were so uncomfortable with precisely because he was strong. That's why people hated him. Because he went around being brash and tough and said things that you're not supposed to say. That's why people hated him. That's why the media elites were so uncomfortable with him. And I'm by no means a fan or supporter of Donald Trump. As just a neutral observer, this would never in a million years have happened if he was still president.
He put out that very strange statement saying how sort of impressive Putin had been. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that, to be honest. Did you see that?
Well, he's correct. Of course, this is what people don't want to hear. Like, people think I'm this massive critic of Vladimir. I'm not. This isn't about Putin being this evil guy or Xi Jinping being this evil guy. Of course they're going to do this. If the West pulls out, of course they're going to do this. If the West is weak, of course they're going to do this. Like I said to you before, all these people want is the prosperity and the stability and the safety that we in the West enjoy. And they want to deliver it for their people. And if we refuse to assert our own dominance, they're going to come for it.
So the aspects of Trump that you think would have repelled Putin are basically a kind of unpredictability, kind of machismo, or a sort of happiness using power and force, enjoying military. Is that the kind of vibe? So we should be looking for leaders to replace these weaklings that we don't like with people with those attributes. Is this really a wise plan?
Well said, Freddie. It's not the wise plan. I don't think that every leader has to be like Donald Trump. I was not advocating for him to be the leader now. What I'm saying is that he is a reflection of a broader phenomenon, which is we are deliberately choosing people who are weak and deliberately afraid of choosing people who are strong. Now, strength does not have to look like the Donald Trump, this abrasive, constantly triggering everyone sort of way. There are different ways to be strong. There are ways to be strong in a way that is also understanding of people's concerns, but to reinforce the values that we in the West have. And there have been presidents and prime ministers in the past who've been able to articulate that vision in a way that was easier for people to hear. But in any presidential election and any prime ministerial election, you only have a choice between two candidates or three candidates. So the choice of the last election was Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and Joe Biden was elected for one reason and one reason only, that he was not Donald Trump.
Let me end with a little look into the future, Konstantin Kisin style. Do you have any confidence that this is going to go well? Do you see the kind of West pulling itself together, reasserting itself, everything being fine in the end, or do you feel pessimistic?
I don't see that far into the future, Freddie, I'm afraid. There are certain things that were very easy to predict here, and a lot of people miss them, which I think is why we're having this conversation. But there are a lot of things that are very difficult to predict. Like I say, I think there are many people who've believed for quite some time that what they say on Twitter is true because they have 70,000 followers or 80,000 followers. And this has disabused many of us, I think, of that notion, and it's opened a lot of people's eyes. Now, what happens once the eyes are open is not within my power to predict. We're going to see. This is the one thing I hope people take away from our conversation is, and this is the most important thing in my opinion, this is not about Ukraine. This is about you. This is about you and your children and their children. This is going to run for decades, and the impact of this will be felt for decades on all of our lives. And how we react to this is the ultimate challenge to the West. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I do hope that this has been enough of this has been shock therapy enough that we start to wake up and start to realize what we need to do.
Konstantin, thanks for chatting to us. Let's do it again.
Thanks for having me, Freddie. Pleasure.
Thank you to Konstantin Kisin for sharing the time and chatting to us. He runs a great YouTube channel over at Trigonometry. Do check it out. Like him, I've been asking questions about which voices we should be trusting, which opinions are really relevant at a time like this when it's so much about brute force and realpolitik. But we are looking for them, and I can tell you we've already found some really interesting people coming up next week who know a great deal about the area, a great deal about what's going on, and hopefully will provide a different and illuminating perspective.